Oh my goodness. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it might be out there where you are. It's so good to see you. My name is Jeff Fritz, and welcome back. This is going to be episode 2 of C# with CSharpFritz. Look at it. It's all nice and sunny outside. Oh my goodness. Welcome in. How you doing there, chat room? We're in for another morning, another fantastic day working on and learning all about C#. We're going to get some more basics down around building with C#, learning a little bit about programming. We're going to do it using our interactive Jupyter notebooks, so you don't have to install a thing. Sit back, click through to the website that we're going to give you here, and let's have a good time asking questions, exploring a little bit about how we can build with the C# programming language. How we doing there, chat room? Let me see. I think I've got the chat room set up there. There it is. Shy Sharp is here. Beldathis. It's Litany. Hello, hello. Bruno Bog. Lophurt. Ancient Coder is here as well. So good to see you. Oh, my goodness. Good to see some friends there hanging out. Hello, hello. Not sure why that timed you out there, GK Smith, but not awake yet. That's okay. We've got some coffee. We're ready to get things going here. So if you weren't with us last time, we're building a collection. We're building out towards a playlist out on the .NET YouTube channel, youtube.com/DOTNET. Click on the videos tab there and you'll see the first episode of this series. We're going to continue building out episodes here so that you can follow along, take your time, and I hope you enjoy the talk show-like format that we're going to use here, where everything's game around beginner content and beginner questions to get you started. This isn't a course. This isn't a piece of reference material. This is a series of shows where we're going to have a good time talking together about building with Visual Studio and C#. So there's a question here from It's Litany. Who do I need to speak with so I can get a GitHub hat? So I've got my GitHub hat on today. GitHub has a swag shop that these hats are available at. You can go check that out. Hope everyone has a wonderful day. Well, thank you, Harrison. Yeah, I think we're going to have some fun here today. John Calloway. Hello, hello. Good to see you. I've got my coffee all set to go here. I spent some time yesterday going through and structuring, setting up our next Jupyter notebook. So these are notebooks. These are interactive documents that I want you to check out. I want you to click through on the web page and interact with. Click around. There's some sample code there. Change it. Break it. You can't damage it. You can always go back and revert to the way it previously was. But try it out as we talk through the samples, as we talk about the various things that we're going to be learning about with C# today, and see what makes sense for you. Figure out what feels right and what's the right way for you interacting with C#. Now, last time we talked about types, and we talked about the built-in types in C#. Now, to some folks that might be a little bit lame. I mean, it's the first show, it's the first session, getting folks into and learning about where they can get access to the programming language, where they can use it, how they can use it, and learning about types, things like booleans and strings and numbers. You got to start somewhere. You need to know what these basic types are when you start working with the programming language. And we learned about C#'s specific syntax and where you can go to learn more. The notebooks are interactive documentation. There's links out to the official Microsoft Docs so that you can learn more. Get in and learn more about anything in the programming language that's going to help you advance your career, advance the projects you're working on, become a better programmer. So let's get into, let's go over to the our GitHub repository, take a look at where we are, and we'll start up the next notebook and start talking about today's session, where we're going to learn about building classes. And we're going to go and start from the very beginning and go very simple in talking about things like access modifiers, scope, constructors. How do we build properties? What are fields? We're going to get into methods at some point, maybe even events. Events are a little bit more tricky, but we might get into events today if we get far enough along. All right, chat room, let's head over. Well, oh, you know what? Let me get some music playing in the background here. I play stream beats from our friend Harris Heller. These are copyright-free songs. This is music that you can use anywhere you'd like. This is from a playlist he has called Synthwave. And it's a little bit tech. It's a little bit funky. And it's a little bit groovy that we can listen to in the background while we're talking, hanging out, and learning about C# together. So I encourage you to check that out. This is Stream Beats from Harris Heller. You can find it on YouTube. You can find it on Spotify. Everywhere that you can listen to music, you can find Stream Beats available. All right. Hey, Asheroth. Good to see you. All right. Just want to make sure that that's not too overpowering. All right. You're out of Twitch. Yeah. Sorry about that. That wasn't... yeah, Stream Elements kind of went off there. I don't know why it did that, but... There we go. Manu, hello, welcome. So, let me head over to the code, and we'll take a look. We'll take a look at our GitHub repository. I'll drop a link here in chat. So this is C# with CSharpFritz. You can find this out on GitHub. There's the link for you. And we are in AMA mode. This is Ask Me Anything. If you have questions, if you want to learn more around C# and .NET for beginners, we're not going to talk about the latest features of C# 9. We're not going to talk about the upcoming release of .NET or Visual Studio. This is for you as beginners to ask questions about how to write code better. What do some of the concepts mean that we're going to interact with? So there's the link out to the GitHub repository, so you can click through. I think that's you, Simon. I'm not seeing any drops here. All right. So, this is our GitHub repository. Sometimes it helps to refresh Twitch. Every now and again I'll get that as well, where the sound pops a little bit and it stutters. It happens. So, you can go out here to this repository out on GitHub, C#/C# with CSharpFritz. And all of our notes, slides, samples, right now we're doing everything in notebooks, so there aren't any slides yet. So all of our samples are inside of a Jupyter notebook. There is also a wiki out here. We're going to drop frequently asked questions in here. Other documents that make sense will load up, but I want to make sure that you're comfortable using GitHub, interacting, and we're going to make sure that we use this GitHub repository as the source of truth for how this series is going to evolve. Switch browser, now it's fine. That's great to hear, Simon. Fantastic. All right. So, let's, do I still have... I don't. That's okay. All right. So, you can check out frequently asked questions. If you have questions about things that we're working on, things that we might be getting into, open an issue. Just go in, create an issue, and ask your question, and we'll build it out. We'll answer and maybe even set up a future session around this. Now, I do need to figure out where our next... I want to set up the schedule for the next 3 or 4 of these so that we kind of know the progression of where we're going to be going with programming language features over about the next month. Maybe plan out through the end of September, with the goal of really getting things laid out so that folks know what's coming and when. And I think that'll make it a little bit clearer how things are going to evolve for us here. So, if you want to get involved, if you want to get started and follow along with this, click through on this Launch Binder button. And this will open the website Binder, which already has a Docker container configured with the Jupyter Notebooks. It's going to start it up and give you a copy of all of those Jupyter Notebooks so that you can run them live in your browser, and you can follow along with the stream as we're going along. Sorry, Martin, we tried and keep this family friendly here, so I'm going to pass on that, but we're happy to see you. What up? We're programming some C# together here today. Happy to see more folks join us. Thank you. All right. So this may take a few seconds. There it is. And you'll see we're going to go into episode 2, classes. Our first session is still here. I called it first session. I probably should have called it something more compelling, like introducing types or something like that. All right. There is a README in the notebooks folder that just says this is a collection of notebooks. I have an extension installed here called Dark Reader, and that's what makes my GitHub take the dark theme here. I like using the dark theme on stream. I think it feels cozy and a little bit more comfortable. Good afternoon, Coded Beard. Welcome. So, this is where I am, and we're going to go into, this is all about classes today. And we're going to learn about this and do some interactive samples. I want to take your questions. Please, I have featured chat running. I have moderator view open here so that we can go through. I don't know if we're going to get to structs today, Ryu. We can talk about structs. We can get there. But I wanted to start simple. And start with classes. We could get into structs. We might get into enums, I guess. Would be down that same line. Ancient Coder says dark theme is better on our eyes since most of us stare at a screen for most of the day. Yeah, right? I like to wear my gunner glasses, my blue blocker glasses, to help. I might put them on a little bit later. We'll see. It's first thing in the morning here, so we'll get into this. Maybe interfaces. I put interfaces in the title here. I'm not sure if we're actually going to get into interfaces. I don't have it in the content as of yet, so let me back out of that. Let me remove interfaces from the title. Now, if you're watching this on the YouTube video, the actual content of this notebook may be different from what you're seeing here on the recording, because I'm going to take feedback as we go through the stream here, and I may apply a couple updates after we get done and before it gets published over there on YouTube. So we'll take a look at this. Structs are the classes in C, says Martin. Okay, structs are something a little bit different in C#. We might get into that here. So classes I think are a little bit simpler for folks to understand than structs, because in C#, structs have some things that they can do, some things that they can't do. So they're a little bit different in C#. So, and honestly, I think I'd rather hold off and talk about structs and enums in another session. So, you have problems with interfaces? Please maybe next session. Okay, tell you what, I'm going to open Notepad here and... No, don't open Notepad. Let's just create an issue right away here. There we go, classes versus structs. Look at this, from Cecil Phillip, absolutely. Interfaces, we need to make sure we talk about interfaces. Maybe for the session on, what would that be, the 24th? The August 24th session. Put that out there. So, all right. So I'm running, this is Jupyter Lab running locally. You can clone down the GitHub repository if you'd like, if you want to run things locally, or like I showed you run this on my binder live out on the web, which means you can do this on your tablet or your phone if you'd like, and listen to me in the background on Twitch if that's the way that you want to interact here. So you're struggling with interfaces. Okay, Ashtaroth. Maybe we talk about that a little bit, but there's a lot that we can do with interfaces, and well, let's see where we get. I want to start with classes today. So we're making our own types, right? Back in session 1, we did built-in and primitive types. Session 1 these are just going to build down the side here as we go along and we add more content. You're going to see we'll have a huge collection of these build out down the side. So if you're watching this recording and there's a lot more episodes of this one, you might see down the left side in that notebooks column a whole lot more than just 1 and 2. Okay, so yeah, I think that's where I wanted to leave that. Let me see a couple other questions here. It's Litany asks, will I be covering internal and partial keywords in classes? Definitely internal. I think we can talk about partial. Let me, now that I'll put in Notepad. Partial class keyword. I think we can definitely talk about that. Let me move that over here on my to-do list to come around to as we're walking through this. Now, first I wanted to talk just briefly about memory utilization. It's a bit early to talk about memory optimization and garbage collection, but I do want to mention to you that classes create reference variables, create reference types, right? And there are 2 different places that we store objects in memory with .NET, okay? There's the stack and the heap, okay? Now, don't get too worried about where these things are, what you can do to look at them. Conceptually, they're out there. And what you need to know when you build classes, you're creating reference types that go on the heap. And the heap gets garbage collected. So as you allocate classes, as you work with these reference types, they will be placed on the heap. And when you no longer reference them later, the .NET garbage collector will come through and release that memory for you. That's all I want to talk about garbage collection for right now. But I want to make sure that you know that there is a garbage collector that manages that memory for you. You don't have to go back and release memory. You don't have to specifically set things to nothing in order to release them. It just is done for you behind the scenes by the garbage collector. And that's kind of cool. Other languages, other frameworks have garbage collectors in memory management as well. And this is what we have here. I provide a link up there to the official .NET garbage collector documentation. If that's something that you want to go through and you're passionate about learning about memory management, go ahead and check that out. There's going to be a, if this is the first time you're looking at and getting involved with garbage collection, you might get overwhelmed quickly because it gets very technical quickly around managing memory. So don't be concerned about that too much for right now. This is strictly for your information, and we'll do a complete session on garbage collection somewhere down the line after we get through the basics with C#. It really is, when we talk about optimization, something that's going to get you a little bit further into your career. All right, I'm keeping an eye on things here, bouncing back and forth between the various. Good. All right, I think we're in good shape. So, how do you define a class? All right, a class is one of our basic building blocks of types that we have in C#, and everything in C# is an object. So a class inherits from the basic object type. It's the most common type that's available to you, and it's real easy to set up and use a class object. You just define a class using the class keyword. So here in this code block, I created a class called student. So you use the class keyword, space, and the name of your class. Now, in C# coding standards, naming standards, we typically start our class names with a capital letter. That way, it becomes a little bit easier to see this is a class variable, right? We've not a class variable, I'm sorry. This is a class type that we've defined. So, because this type student has no modifiers, has no content, this student class is going to be internal. It's going to be available internally to our program or to our library that we've written it in. In this case, it's internal to our notebook page. Okay? So, what does it... What internal... what's that in comparison to? Can I have a private class? No. Classes need to be accessible to things outside of them. So you can't really have a class that's private. You can have a public class that's accessible outside of the library or the program that you've written that class file in. Typically also, classes are stored one per file. So we would see this student class in a student.cs file. I should add that to the documentation here. Let me add this. Classes are typically written into their own files, one class per file. That's kind of a C# standard. Named after, with the file name matching the name of the class inside. In this case, we would create student.cs, and let me put some of that coding documentation there. Good. So that's nice. I've got student.cs, I've got a student file, and all of my content for my class would appear between these curly braces. Okay, curly braces are the way we denote blocks in C#. So we have a class, and we would put some code between those curly braces. How we doing there, chat room? Haven't seen any messages in a little bit. We doing well? All right, I'm going to continue on. Now, classes can be made public, so they're visible outside of our library or our program. And you'll see a lot of folks use public classes by default. That's kind of, that's okay. There are some folks that would say for architecture, for API designs, when we're building programs, we're building classes and interfaces for other folks to call, you might not want things to be public by default. The way you manage and expose classes to other programs really is another topic that folks get very, very studious around, because there's a whole science to what you make available to other folks, what you don't make available to other folks, and whether things are open to be accessed, closed to modification, all kinds of discussion around that when we start talking about how our program is structured. Now, inside of our class, there's a whole bunch of different things that we can write inside there. And I've listed just a few of them here. I didn't want to get into everything that you can build inside of a class, but you can, excuse me, you can create constructors. These are methods that that trigger as you create the instance of a class. Finalizers, which aren't used too frequently, but these are methods that are called when the class is being freed up by the garbage collector. It's right at the end of their life cycle. You might not have control of exactly when the finalizer is called. So people typically use these to do some cleanup operations that they don't know when it might occur. So you're interacting with some things that you don't specifically manage. It's the last chance to release access to it, and you'll write some code to do that in a finalizer. Fields. Fields are variables owned by the class. This means that the class has these variables that are directly owned inside the class, and you can either interact with them because they're private or protected scope typically. You can also make them public scope. There's other scope that you can apply to it as well. And we'll take a look, we'll tinker with that a little bit here in some of our samples later. Constants. We know what constants are. This kind of makes sense. You've seen this probably in other programming languages. These are values that are defined at compile time that never change, right? I'm going to define a constant that is the minimum date value that we can store. That's a constant, okay? Our date type is fixed, and there's a minimum value. That's the minimum date value, right? We could also have a maximum date value. That's the largest date value we can store, right? So these kind of make sense for us, right? Properties are flexible mechanisms that we can use to interact with values stored in a class. They're kind of like fields, but we can do a little bit more with them and actually intercept when we read those values or when we write those values. And that's what a property is, and we're going to see more about properties and a couple different ways that we can make properties today. Methods are some action code that you're going to write. You're going to actually give some action that our class can do, and it'll have some code statements inside of there that accept parameters, return values. You might see methods sometimes called functions, okay? And we're going to create some of those today. Actually, I don't think I wrote any samples for that. We're going to write some on the fly for that. Events and delegates are a little bit more complex here. Events are an interaction point that allows notification. We can send notification to another class that's listening for that event when something of interest, some point of interest occurs, okay? The date was modified, right? Today is Jeff's birthday, whatever it might be. That event occurred, send a notification somewhere else because some other part of our program wants to be able to interact with that. A delegate is a type that can be used to contain a reference to a method. It's not a pointer to a method, but it can hold a reference to a method. Later, we'll see how we can store references, delegate type references to those other methods, and then we have a pointer to some other method, and we can create things called callbacks. And we'll see more about events and delegates in a future stream, but I wanted to include them here for completeness. Finally, I want to make sure that we also have operators listed. So how does our class interact when we use some of those operators that we looked at last time? Like, maybe I create a class that is like we have date. Well, if I use date and the addition operator, well, what does that do? I don't know. And what does equals do with our types? There's a default implementation of what equals does if we test for equality. Well, what does that do? And we saw a little bit about converting between different types. That's an operator also. So how do I convert from one type to another that might be compatible? And we may take a look at operators a little bit later today. I'm not sure if we're going to get to it. So let me continue on if there's no questions. I don't see anything. The chat room has gone dark. I don't see anything over there. All right. So let's start building out our student class. So I'm going to start adding some content here by creating an initial constructor and a couple of very simple properties. So we have a public parameterless constructor right here, right? It's called parameterless because it doesn't have any parameters inside of the parentheses, okay? This is a public constructor, so public, and our constructors have the same name as the class that they're inside of. So this is a public class named student, and we have a constructor that has public student as its signature. So we've set this up so that we can create a student and we would trigger any content, any code that's inside of the curly braces here. In this case, there isn't anything, and this is actually the signature, as I wrote there in the comment, that's generated by default by the compiler. If you don't write any code in here, you're not adding additional value to your student class. But it's there, it allows it to be publicly created, and nothing's going to happen when you create it, right? And you can see here, skipping down, this is where I create a new student class, and when this is executed, new student, and you see that new student half on the right side of the equals, just like we assigned types, whether they were integers or strings in our previous session, we're creating a new student, and that student signature that we use there, this matches the constructor. And that's how we can kind of tie them together and figure out, okay, we're running that method when we execute this line. I've set up 4 very simple properties here for a student, and these are publicly accessible properties that they're actually called automatic properties. And when we talk about properties, we'll get into this. We have first name, last name, age, and is enrolled. And these are of these appropriate types here. So we're going to have a first name should be a string. I don't know of anybody whose name is a number or a boolean. You could create that. You can do that. But here in Jeff's world, people's names are strings. You know what I mean? So, hey Ryan, you've never used Jupyter Notebooks with C#, so make sure you check out. You can click through to the repository here. There we go. And you can see the notebooks. You can download and try them out, or you can click through to the Binder application and interact just like we are here in the browser. We can interact with these properties by just putting dot and then the name of the property we'd like to interact with. So dot first name, and I'll assign Joe, and I'll add a last name of Joe Bag of Donuts. You're going to find is a fictional character that I use in a lot of my samples. It is. Joe happens to be 30 years old, so I set his age to the number 30. And I execute the display S. This is a command for Jupyter Notebooks that will display whatever the type is, or whatever the content is inside of display, okay? So I'm executing the display, and it's going to show me here's all the properties of our student. First name is Joe, bag of donuts, 30 years old, and is enrolled is false. We learned last time that Booleans default to false. You have to explicitly set them to true. Okay, so we have a student who is named Joe Bag of Donuts, 30 years old, and is not enrolled. Okay. If you want to jump ahead, if you want to read more about the documentation, I've included a link here to the official class keyword reference in the Microsoft documentation. That's right, Mosa 9797. This is a basic C# tutorial. Get folks up and running with C#. We're going to go through and take this one step at a time, and we want to make sure that beginners can ask questions and can interact and feel comfortable in this talk show-like format. If you want to watch instructional videos that get you right to it and get you through this quickly without any kind of interaction, without answering your questions, you can certainly do that. There's great material on the .net website. Click the Learn button there, and you can see some great videos from my friends like Scott Hanselman, Kendra Havens, all kinds of great material out there that'll get you started. But here, we're going to keep things relaxed and chatting with you in the chat room. Can we keep it to English, please? I speak English first, and I'm not familiar with what you might be typing there. Oh, no. I hope you didn't just do that. Yeah, you did. So sorry. Goodbye. Interactive is awesome, says most. Well, thank you, and I'm glad you like the format, Asheroth. Let me answer some other questions here. Black Eye says, already learned some things you were doing as default without knowing why. Very cool. Yep, there's a link to the Jupyter notebooks. Let me bring up, here's a couple good questions. Let's make sure that we get into this. GK Smith. Yes, we're going to be getting into some other... We're going to get more into classes and building types here. This is Lophert? I hope I pronounced that correctly. Is it necessary to use the public access modifier before the class type? No, it is not. You don't need to do that. You can declare, just like I did in my first sample, you can declare the class without a modifier, and it will have the internal scope of your project. It'll be available internally to your project, to your class library, to your application, to your program. You don't have to use that. I can certainly get rid of this, and this code sample, I'll rerun it. There it is. It still runs, and you can see I still get Joe Bag of Donuts, 30 years old, and is not enrolled. I can change this, and I can make this internal, which is the default type of that, and I reran it, and you see Joe Bag of Donuts is still there and false. I encourage you, if you want to follow along, browse through, click that link in the GitHub repository, and tinker with some of the code here. Yeah, we don't have to name this Joe Bag of Donuts. We can make this Mary Contrary, right? Whoever, right in there. Whoever it might be, right? And change up the age, tinker with this. See what happens when you do whatever with this, right? Maybe Mary's 15 years old. Done, right? I can even set that is enrolled, right? Yes, Mary is enrolled, and now my class contains information that shows that this student is enrolled. Link to the repository again, absolutely. There you go, there's the link. Is the it's Litany asks a question here. Let me queue up a couple questions here. Boat over boat. Where's the Jupyter Notebook Basics course? Some of the hotkeys that I'm using here, you can click into the second button if you're using Jupyter Lab, and there are some hotkeys that you can see down here for interacting with the various cells that you interact with. To rerun some code, right, I'm clicking into here, but you see the blue line down the side? When that blue line is next to some code, I press enter and it activates and puts my cursor inside of there. When I'm ready to rerun that code, right, so, right, if I change this to, I don't know, whatever age, Control Enter will rerun the code, and you can see Karnak is putting some of the hotkeys that I'm using in the top left corner as I'm going along. Let me... Oh, in NFG codecs, that's a great question. Let's get to that. Absolutely. Harrison, that's a good question. Let me queue that up. Very good questions. Let me go through these. I've got 5 questions lined up. We've just built our first class. We've displayed it, and there's information about the person that we've stored in this class type. Let me go down the questions here and bring these up. We're going to start with It's Litany. Asks, are the get and set commands right here, right? You see get, semicolon, set, semicolon. Are they needed for the properties? So we're going to get to properties a little bit further down in the notebook. A property is a data point that you store with your class. First name, last name, age. These are properties of our student object. Now, you need to define if we're allowed to get that data, if we're allowed to set that data. In this case, these are called automatic properties, and they automatically allow you to get and set. You're going to see a little bit further down, we're going to tinker with whether we can get, whether we can set. what those things look like and how we interact with it. More on this in the next 20 minutes or so. Spoiler alert! We're going to get into properties in just a little bit. NFG Codex has a question here. The next question for us. Does C# have a way to shorthand field assignment? TypeScript has this format: constructor, public, first name, string, which will automatically assign this dot first name. Great question. I didn't get into this as part of the allocation here when I created a student named Mary Contrary. I can certainly use, there is a little bit of markup that we can use for this, so let's create another student. So I'm going to call this, right, let's call this next one Codex. I can say new student, and instead of providing the parentheses there, well, yeah, I'll provide the parentheses because I'm creating a new student. I can now specify those properties immediately right here inside my curly braces. So I can say first name equals NFG, right? And I can say last name equals Codex. And notice I'm putting commas, not semicolons in between these. And this lets us do that initial property or field assignment, right? And I can say age equals 20, right? I'm not sure your age. And I can say is enrolled equals false. And now if I say display Codex, run that, I'm missing a semicolon. Do I need one here? Need one down here. There we go. So now I've created a second. Let me hide the question there. And now I've created a second, and right, it's a way for me to consolidate those statements, just like you're suggesting. Put them into that same constructor definition, right? That same statement where we're defining our student so that we're assigning the properties at the point that it's created. And there's our NFG Codex student. Not quite what you meant, but that's interesting. So I think some of the next bit in constructors are going to get into a little bit more of what you're talking about, and we're going to see that in a second. Harrison464, and I would encourage you, NFG, go ahead and scroll down. You'll see what I'm talking about in the next section. Maybe a little early, but if I set it as private, will these objects be accessible through an interface? No, they will not. If I make these properties private, they will not be accessible through an interface, and we'll talk more about interfaces. I think we're going to end up hitting it next time. But things are only accessible through the interface if they're explicitly attached to the interface or if they're made public. And two different ways to interact with that. Tell you what, Harrison, let's add this question to our interfaces question over here. I'm going to copy your question, and I'm going to make sure that I address that in the next section here. All right, so I'll just add that in to our next session where we talk about this. So I will add your question to make sure that I come back and cover that explicitly when we talk about interfaces. Thank you so much for that question. Boat Over Boat has a question here as well. Let's bring that one up. Could it be useful to include a comment that said that the display S is not a C# function? That's fair. Sure. Let's do that. Right, so this is not a C# or .NET function, but rather a Jupyter Notebook feature to display the content. Yeah, the content inside. Inside parentheses, right? So, and I won't include that in the further samples here, but now you know a little bit of information there. Thank you, Boat Over Boat, for that constructive feedback. Very much appreciate, and I'll make sure that I include that in our documentation. So this is another reason I'm running this locally, so that when we get done, I can commit this sample and it'll be updated for everybody to see. All right. Mosa asks, as an individual developer, how do I protect my C# code from decoding? It's easily decoded. I hope you don't mind asking. So I think what you're referring to is having our code decompiled. Here's the thing. It doesn't matter what programming language you write. It doesn't matter how much encryption or obfuscation you add to your program. Every programming language can be decompiled, and folks can look at the contents of it. You see this happen a lot with video games, where folks, as a new patch is being delivered, folks will decompile and look at the contents of it and announce features before the game developer. So yeah, there's people daily on Twitch that are reverse engineering. You're right, NFG codecs, and everything can be reverse engineered. So if this is something you're concerned about, if you're putting code on, if you're giving binaries, right, you're giving applications to developers, to users, for them to run locally on their workstation, they're going to be able to do this. It doesn't matter what it is. It's going to happen. Be ready. There are tools that will make obfuscation easy for you to do and make it more difficult for folks to read your code, but it's going to happen. They can reverse engineer that anyway. Beldathis has a question here for us. Can you specify a default value for properties? Like, for example, if I specify nothing, then the age would be 20. Spoiler alert. But I will make sure I include that when we get to properties a little bit further down. We're going to get to this in just a few minutes. Absolutely, Beldathis, you can do that. And you'll see if you scroll down in the notebook, you'll see it down a little bit further. CNZ says you can use server-side applications to prevent your code from being decompiled. Yeah, if you stash your code somewhere else, like on a server, hide it behind an API. Yeah, people won't be able to get to your code. All right. How are we doing there? Oh my gosh. APS Twitch, you are spot on. We need to keep an eye out for this one. Everyone is going to be able to find out the secret to your Hello World program. Huh? Huh? Okay. All right. Maybe not so much. Thank you, APS Twitch. Yeah. Maybe. All right. Well done. So go ahead and, right, feel free to tinker with the code here, right, and see that it does create an error if you, right, try to make this, hey, Mary Contreras 25, well, those aren't numbers, right? Go ahead and break, do some things in here, and see what happens. I'm adding some notes here for future shows as well while we're going along. So next we're going to talk about constructors, and I think this is a little bit where NFG Codex was going. So, right, we said var s equals new student, and it triggered this method here. So let's put some extra content in there, right? So we can actually have some action code in there that will do different things to interact with our student. So I can say is enrolled equals true, because students by default are enrolled in whatever the school is they're attached to, the learning institution they're attached to. So we can say is enrolled equal true, and as this method is being executed here on this line, it will go through and run any code inside these curly braces. So it's going to execute and set the is enrolled value to true. And for Joe Bag of Donuts, we only set first name, last name, and age. And you see Joe is now enrolled just when we go and create him inside of this class. Now, to what NFG Codex was saying, well, can I have inside my constructor ways to specify some of those fields? You'll see folks in their C# class design, they'll overload, they'll create additional constructor signatures so that you can pass in some of those values. So here in this sample, I've added an overload where we're going to specify our student's age as we create a new student. So we can now say var s equals new student and pass in the value 30, and we end up with a student with, well, with null names and age 30, because those, right, those strings default to the null, not even empty string, but the null value, right? Okay, that's one way you can interact with this, but we can do more. And I've added a note here for those of you that are watching. Try interacting, try improving this code above to make sure that every student created has a name and an age. So if you want to walk through and do that, and you're watching on the recording, go ahead and hit pause and walk through. And when you think you have a solution, when you think you have this working properly, go ahead and hit play so you can see exactly how I'm going to walk through and improve this student class so that we assure that every student has a name. All right, now hopefully those folks have just hit unpause that are watching the recording, and let's go through and let's improve our student. Now, I'm going to move down this is enrolled and put this down in here with this other constructor to make sure that every student is enrolled by default. And I'm going to get rid of this constructor up top because I want to force you to create a student that has a name and an age. So I can add additional input parameters to my constructor method here by specifying type and the name of the parameter that I'm going to bring in. And all right, I had int age, so I will add string first name and I will add string last name. And this is a little bit of a C# convention as well. For our parameters to methods, we'll do them in this, let me get it right, we'll do them in this camel case where the first letter of our parameter name is lowercase and the next word, right, so first name, the N in name will force to uppercase, and every word further along in our variable name starts with an uppercase letter. So first name, last name are this camel case notation. So I can now set those values to my properties. I don't have to, right? You can see I referred to the property here is enrolled. I can optionally put the this modifier in front of it to refer to this class and interact with it there. So you have your choice of ways that you call and interact with the rest of your class when you're inside of it. So let's set the first name. And let's set the last name appropriately here. And if I run this with this syntax now, I get an error because creating student here only has one input parameter. I need to define and assign other input parameters here to create my student. So let's do that. We'll put our first name. We'll create me. There's Jeff Fritz, and I'll control enter, and there's Jeff Fritz, age 30, and he's enrolled as a student. Okay. Pretty easy to see that I need to have the same signature in my constructor as I do in my constructor method up top. When I initialize this S variable. It needs to match the student up top. Chat room, I see a handful of questions there. I'm going to come back to that in just a second. Now, interestingly, right, some other student, can I say new student and use that syntax without an input parameter? No, you can't. Because we removed the parameterless constructor, it's no longer available. Because I defined another constructor, that compiler-generated parameterless constructor is no longer available to you. You now must always create a student using the 3 input parameters that we specified up top. So be aware that you're now locking in, you're now forcing your student to be created with those 3 parameters. In this case, this actually makes sense because students should have a name and should have an age for the types of fields that I have available here. So I want to force, whenever a student object is created, that a name and an age must be supplied. So that's a way for you to ensure that those properties are set when you create these objects. All right, chat room, let me take a look back over here, see if we have some questions. Abhi asks, is this Python? No, this is C#. Take a look at the title. C# with CSharpFritz. We're writing C# here. We happen to be in Jupyter Notebooks and using the .NET Interactive plugin. More information about how that is configured, and you can get access to our notebooks there in our GitHub link that I just dropped in. Asterisk 6, not asterisks. Asterisk 6, nice. Has a question for us. Nope, the Jupyter Notebook format is not Python only. There are all kinds of kernels that you can get that will work with Jupyter Notebooks. Now I see some folks are trying to trigger the the bot that's normally running on my channel. Not today. It's turned off. We're only running here in the Visual Studio channel. Let me answer this question from Asterisk 6. For a simple class that just holds properties, would a struct be a better performance option? I don't think we're going to get to structs today. And if I'm just storing properties like this, it might be a better performance option. Depends on how you interact with it. It can be. Structs are stored differently from classes. Classes are reference types. Structs are value types, which means they're stored differently in memory. And I think we definitely need to look at structs and some other types in our next session. So I think we can definitely talk about that next time. Like I said, maybe you can do that. You can use a struct for this, and you can look at the documentation to read more about structs, but depends on how you're going to use it inside of other elements of your code. Is that our style code? Probably too early, but is there any way to destroy .NET's string system with fully safe C# code? Take a look at the span of T. Span of T, memory of type T, right? And you will see that type is referenced and looks like this. Go ahead and take a look at that in the documentation, and you can interact with strings using span of T, memory of type T, and have fully safe C# code that works with strings very, very efficiently. I think that's what you're asking about. Let me know. All right. No, you didn't miss a lot. APS Twitch, not at all. And all of the notebooks are available. This is being recorded, and it will be available over on the YouTube channel later. That's right, Abhi. structs do not support inheritance because they're value types. Next thing I want to talk about here is chaining constructors. So that's great. We had 2 constructors in this student class before. You can have one constructor call another constructor by putting colon and this, see that there? After the definition of your signature of your constructor. This way, when we use this constructor to create a student, after it's done executing it, this method, the other constructor, will then be triggered. So var s equals new student, age 30. When I display it, you see it set the is enrolled value from up top here. So these are ways that we can connect our constructors together and have them trigger and interact with each other. All right. So this is something you'll see folks do if you have very complex classes. They'll set up the class constructors so that there's different signatures depending on what information you're providing, and hand off to other constructors so they minimize the amount of code that's rewritten between the different methods. There's other ways around this. If you don't like chaining constructors like this, there's other ways to do these interactions, but this is one possibility of how you could write your class files. All right. Now we had some questions about properties. There's a try this if you'd like. Go ahead and you can tinker and rerun and see what happens with the student class there. So next I wanted to talk about properties. Now properties, we had defined and we had created this automatic property with the get set signature, right? And we have these gets and sets here. Now there was a question earlier, do we always have to get and set values? Do we always have to use those? And this is where we're going to start to tinker with this. Well, depends. I see another question here. Let me just back up. Let me pause for a second. From Britain92. Let's answer Britain's question here. When you're chaining the constructors together, will the default constructor be called before or after the other constructor? Let's take a look. So if I put, I wonder if I can do this. Can I do this? Can I put that in there? Let's see what happens. It's actually called before. So take a look. Right? We created a new student and we passed in the age. So the age was 30. We ended up with 30 and is enrolled true, but I put display in here so we can kind of inspect values as it's running. So display the is enrolled value. Well, at this point, is enrolled is set to true. Similarly, if I come up here and I add display age, the age is set to 0. So when we chain these together, it's going to start executing it. Execute this method, so back up to here, go through this, and then execute this section of the code, and then be done. So we've chained together. If you need to know the priority, the order that these things are set, whatever is connected is executed first, and then the contents. You're welcome, Britton. Thank you for asking. I'm glad I could explain that. That's something that I may have misspoke earlier, but now you've seen exactly when and the order that these things are triggered. All right. And I could probably change that to display, and I could say running the parameterless constructor. Oops, hang on. Started running all over the place. And I can change this to say running the age constructor so that we know. And now you can see the order that they run right here. I think that's a little bit clearer to show in the notebook. Thank you, Britton. I'm gonna save that so that I'll update the code later, and we'll see it actually. We'll see it in the repository for folks. Hey there, Coding with Sean. Yeah, we're not getting into abstract and inheritance, any of that stuff yet. We'll see that later. But this is how we can chain these together. All right, so we were starting to talk about properties. Now, properties, we had just get set for all of these. So we can get and set values for our first name and last name and our age, okay? And when we have this constructor here where we're forcing the age to be passed in, we might not want folks outside of our student class to be able to set that age. So we can change the access modifier on the set capability to make it private. This effectively makes the age read-only. So now when I go and create my student, new student, 30, and I display their age, okay, there we go. I've got their age of 30. But if I remove these comments here, and we try and set the age to 25, because what 30-year-old doesn't actually want to be 25? Now I get an error. Student.age cannot be used in this context because the set accessor is not accessible, is inaccessible, right? So these are accessors, right? They define how you can access the property. And you're going to see in a little bit, we can actually write some more code with that. And because I've made it private for age, it's inaccessible. You can't change that later. Okay. I see another question here about constructors. I'm happy to pause and back up. This is a question from Mosa. Why parameterless constructors are called when we use the parametered constructor? They're not. Because I've chained it together, like using this syntax, it does get called. If I remove that syntax and right, let me comment these two out again, right? And if instead of displaying s.age, I just display our student, if I remove that call, just comment it out, right? And now run it. It doesn't call the parameterless constructor. It only gets called because I put that extra call up at the top, right? Because I added this to chain it together, do I get it calling into both of them? Not a problem, Mosa. I'm glad to explain that and take a second to emphasize. So, please take a look. Click through the link on the GitHub repository, and you can interact with the binder and tinker with this. Change the code, break it. You're not going to damage anything. You're not going to crash anything. You've seen I've created errors here, and it's not a problem. I can continue working. Okay. If that slightly different, the giggles. Let me put up, here's a question from the giggles about the constructor chaining again. Let me scroll back up here. If that class was inherited from a base class, and we'll get into this later, you can also use base to reference a base constructor. Yes. More about that when we get into abstract classes later. And I think we're going to end up doing abstract classes and interfaces in the same session here. As well with base constructor. Cool. And please feel free to go out to the issues here, log some issues, things that you may want to learn more about, things that you want me to cover in a future session. you can add to the issues of the GitHub repository. Is there a schedule? Numberfish asks. You know what? I need to do that. I need to put together a schedule. Like I said, I want to go and put a schedule together going out through the end of September for different topics. And some of the things that I'm hearing from you folks here today are helping to drive some of that planning. So I will absolutely, I'll publish a schedule. Maybe we'll put it right here on the front of the README with some information about it. But you'll be able to find Monday mornings, 9 a.m. Eastern, 6 a.m. Pacific, 1300 UTC. We'll be here on Twitch, and the recordings will be released a little bit later in the day, along with updated and fully updated versions of the Jupyter notebooks, linked, and all of the questions like this one from Numfish. I'm sorry, I mispronounced your name. From Numfish, linked inside the YouTube video, YouTube description. You'll be able to click through to all of those questions and jump right to learning something more about that. Okay, I'm not going to jump out too far there. GK Smith figured out Jupyter. It is very cool. There are instructions here to install Jupyter notebooks with .NET Interactive. So if you want to work with C#, F#, even PowerShell inside of your Jupyter notebooks, there's instructions here if you'd like to set up and run that. Okay, so I'm going to continue with properties. So we had a private setter we defined on our age property so that you couldn't set the age from outside of our class. It's private. It can only be set internal to our class. Now, I could make this internal set. Now, by changing the scope from private to internal, it now says, well, only other classes that can see this class inside of my same project file, my same unit of compilation, whether it's a project or the same program, right? The same class library, can actually execute and interact with my age there. So now I can do that and set my age down here. Let's just display the full student, and you can see now my student is now age 25. Yes! Lost 5 years, back in my 20s. So that's a thing. Okay? So, private, internal, you can add there. What's important to note is that those are less accessible keywords, less accessible scopes than the default scope that's defined out here before the variable, the property type. So public integer age, if I made that internal, then only those other classes in the same project would be able to even read the age. They wouldn't be able to set it because they're not private, they're not inside the class, but they're still internal to the same project and would be able to read it publicly outside of the class, publicly outside of the project from another project. I would not be able to interact with the age at all. So, no, Code with Sean, we're going to get there. We're going to get there. So, a couple good questions here from the chat room. Let me queue these up and we'll go through these. GK Smith asks, what are some good use cases for internal and or private properties? So a property that is completely private and cannot be accessed outside of the class. Things that you may want to do beyond just getting and setting, reading and writing that value, right? Maybe there's something that you want to trigger, some other interaction that needs to occur when you set the age. I don't know, right? Somebody changes their name, right? And here's maybe a decent example, right? Here in the States, when a woman gets married and wants to change their last name, they have to go to the courthouse, go through a whole process. Well, maybe there's a process, there's something else, some other code that we need to run when the last name is set. Okay, well, that's something I may want to make internal and open up that set operation so that it can only be done as it goes through an approved process, and it can't just be willy-nilly changed, right? It can't just be changed by anybody on the fly. You have to actually go through a gated process, and that's why you might make it internal or private interaction with those things, so that you can only interact with it using a specific interaction, a specific method, an action piece of code that will take those steps appropriately and produce the appropriate audit trail for legal reasons or whatever it might be when we're talking about changing someone's name. So there's things like that. Let me put down. So yes, we need to get to encapsulation. It's a little bit, yeah, we'll get there. Another question here from Black Eye asks, when would you use a read-only property versus a constant? This is an interesting question, and you know what, I didn't put constants into the notebook, so yeah, well, I think we can get to constants. Constant would be something, right, I'm trying to think, what would be a constant for a student? A student constant. So a student constant might be maximum years enrolled, right? What's the maximum number of years that you can be enrolled? And maybe for an elementary school, it's 5 years. So you might define a constant that is 5 years, right? Maximum enrollment is 5 years. And you might have a read-only property that is the current enrollment duration. Well, here, you know, student Jeff has only been enrolled for 4 years, and that's a read-only property that is only accessible. You can't change the enrollment duration that Jeff's been enrolled, but you can read how long Jeff has been enrolled, and you can interact with that constant that says, well, the maximum enrollment time is 5 years. I see some questions here. Why do I have the Microsoft logo? Because this is a Microsoft channel for this educational series. I do work for Microsoft. I do not work for Minecraft. Minecraft is a different portion of the company. I've done work with Xbox, but I have not done work on Minecraft. Let me see. A couple other... Oh, Shy Sharp has a question here. Let me put that up. Mosa has a question about .NET Core. Hey, PyroCat. Hello, hello. You found a wandering Fritz. That's me. That's me. Shy Sharp has a question here. Can the first construction be internal so it can't be created outside of this? Ah, there's a very good point. Excellent point. So where I chained these together, good catch, Shy Sharp. You can change this scope to be internal, so only other classes in my project can construct with the parameterless constructor. And let me remove that, and you can see, you can't see because it's behind there. So I can force that to be internal. I'll go you one further. I can make that private. And now nobody outside of the class can call that constructor, right? If I do this, it doesn't work. It's not accessible because I've removed internal or public access to that first constructor. Very good point. So I'm now required to use that, and that other method, that other constructor, is still visible inside of my class. There's another question here from Mosa. What's the difference in all the languages that use .NET Core? Is it only syntax or something else? Mostly syntax. They don't have explicit areas that, oh, you can only do this with F#. Oh, you can only access this part of .NET in Visual Basic. That's not the case. They've each got their own set of language features that allow you to interact, whether you want to be very object-oriented with C#. If you want to be very functional, you can use F#. If you want to use that case-insensitive Visual Basic that's been around for a very, very long time, and you know that the programming language is extremely stable and is only going to get enhancements when there's new .NET features that require language enhancements. Things like async and await. Things like memory of T and span of T. These features where we're interacting with memory directly. And that's a much, much more advanced feature that we're not going to get to for a very long time. When those features are added to the framework, then we'll see updates added to Visual Basic or C# or F# appropriately, so that the languages can interact with those framework features. So, good question. Would Minecraft run better if it were rewritten in C#? If it were up to me, possibly, because .NET Core is proven to be one of the fastest frameworks available out there. So possibly, depends. I wouldn't go down that chain now because Minecraft has been, and I believe there was an experiment to rewrite it with .NET, with C#. But there's so much legacy code out there with Java, and interacting with it, it would break the ecosystem around Minecraft if they were to do that. So, I'm not looking forward to that at all. Do I have blue hair? Maybe. Maybe. I'm not saying, but I'm just saying. Maybe. What am I doing? We're teaching about C# today. This is a C# basics session, and if you're interested in following along, if you want to get your hands on the Jupyter Notebook, I need to put this link into a bot so folks can get to this and have it echoed out to the chat room every few minutes. There you go. There's the GitHub link. If you're watching the recording, check in the description just below the video here. Make sure you click more information there, open it up. You're going to find links in out to the binder for this, so you can interact and use these notebooks live in your browser, and also to the GitHub repository so that you can actually clone and run those locally if you'd like. Open some issues, ask some questions about some things that you would like to learn here on this series, and we'll come back and cover those at some point. And I'm going to build out a schedule out there of shows so that you can find and follow along in the future. See that? Look at this. I'm seeing the kind words about the blue hair. Thank you. There's a on my channel, on the CSharpFritz channel here on Twitch, we're doing a channel points drive right now for my birthday next week. If we get to a 500,000 channel points contributed, I'm gonna dye the beard to match the hair. I don't do that on Microsoft channels, but I'll do it over on my channel here on Twitch. Aztec Consulting asks a question here. I think I need to include this in the FAQ. There we go. What's the source of that slide out animation you were using to show questions as you go? What slide out animation? I don't know what you're talking about. This is called featured.chat. This is a plugin that you can use. You connect it up to your Twitch channel, and it'll sit there in chat, and it will give you a list of everybody's chat messages, and I can choose to put them up on screen here. Let me add that to the wiki here real quick, because that's a good question we're going to get here, and I want to make sure that folks know more about featured.chat, and you have a link to go out and learn more about that. So I'm going to add that to our wiki. What displays the viewers' questions on screen during the broadcast? That is featured.chat. Let me make sure we actually link that, because it sounds weird. Featured.chat. Did you know .chat is a top-level domain name? It is. It is. Listens for messages in Twitch chat, allowing moderators to place the contents on screen. Not contents, messages on screen. And there's all kinds of ways that we can configure how those messages appear. I can include your avatar. I can include other indicators around your name. But for this channel, for this show, I think that's plenty. Added entry about featured.chat. There we go. There it is, and now it's in our FAQ. All right. Any other questions for us to get into here? Looks good for now. Okay. We've got about a half hour left together. Let me go through and talk about, here's a next sample where maybe we don't allow folks to set at all. So for this sample, maybe we know that the birth date of all students is June 1st, 2000. Let's just assume everybody's born June 1st, 2000. We could update our age property to remove the set. That should be set operation. Set operation. We could not say turnaround. We could update, right? I think that makes more sense. There we go. To make it a get that's just calculating against the known birth date. So now we're getting a property, and that property is being derived from some other value. So instead of my age having a get and set here, now I've got a method. So inside of my age property, right, we had get set to automatically wire this up before and store that value and read that value from somewhere else that we don't care. The compiler stores that somewhere for us. Now we're going to write some code that's going to specify how we get that value. So we have our same get accessor that we define here, and we have a block of code. Block of code in C# is wrapped in curly braces. So curly braces. And we're going to return the math floor, so round it to an integer, date time now, so right now, subtract June 1st, a new date, June 1st, 2000. Give me the total number of days between now and June 1st, and divide it by 365. I just want to get a rough number of years. It's not perfect, but for the purposes of this demo, it's good enough. And now when I create a new student and I display their age, it's 20. I can't interact with the age. I can't set that value, right? I can't say S age equals 30. Can't do it. Age is read-only. It only has a getter. So I can only get that value. Now things start to get a little bit more interesting. Now we can do some things with our properties where we can have properties that derive from other values. And that's where fields come in. There was also a question earlier about having default values for properties. So before I get to fields here, I'm going to add a note to write a little bit of documentation here about default values for properties. Details, right? Details to come. I'll write some documentation in here so that I don't need to I'll add some documentation in here so that later you can click through and find this. But if we just do a display of our student, now that age is being calculated. The question about if can we have a default value? Sure. What you can do is you can assign that value right here on the property by saying equals and assign whatever the default value is, right? Joe Schmo. And now I haven't even assigned, I haven't interacted with those, and I have a default value. Now, every student by default is going to be called Joe Schmo. That's going to be a weird school to go to. But this is a way that you can define default properties. And I will update and add a little sample here after default values with some with another entry here to talk about adding these default values. Okay, so let me yeah, details to come, needs code sample, and I'll make sure that I add that, and you'll find it with the notebook sometime later today. I'll work on this. You got put in Twitch jail? What happened there? What? Not a fan of how Stream Elements is blocking you there, GK. Let me take a look at the bot here, and I see some other comments, some other questions coming in. Happy to take a look at those in just a second. It's interesting. It's the Stream Elements bot that's going a little caps. It doesn't say why it struck that. With excessive amounts of capital letters. No. I'm gonna make this 30 seconds. Please don't use so many capital letters. We don't need to shout. Okay. All right. Couple other questions coming through. Let me make sure I get to these. So sorry about that, GK Smith. Once you become a regular, it won't block you for things. And if you use LUL, you'll get the emote popping out there. Let me click through, and I'm going to answer a couple of questions here. You learned something. That's great, GK Smith. No, you're not disliked. Not at all. Lemons Galore with a comment here. Write simple code that is self-documenting. Yes and no. Ewerton Crazy. You've arrived. You're now in the stream. Well, welcome. Couple questions here from Caparino. That are a little bit further along here, but we may get to it. What are the differences between fields and properties in a class? So this is what we're going to talk about in the next section here, Harrison, where fields are quite literally a variable that belong to the class that you can put a scope accessor to it, private, internal, public, and you can interact with it from inside, outside the class, and you interact with it directly. Unlike a property where I can change the accessor so that I'm only granting set access outside of this class and inside my project, or I'm setting it publicly and I can modify that, and I can also make properties derive from other values, like you see in this next sample here, where I have a birth date that I'm going to pass in and stash that birth date in my birth date field up here, and turn my age property then into just deriving from now and subtract the birth date to get the age of our student. So down here you see I've set the birth date to October 2003 and the age is 16 years. So difference between fields and properties. Field is strictly a variable. A property we can interact with and we can do different things as we get and set, or maybe we read a derived value to interact with that value. So there's lots of options there with a property, where the field is, it's just a value that's being stored. Shug M1020 asks, I'm an absolute beginner. I know some Python. What should I learn or do now? Go forth, my son. Go forth, conquer the world. No, I know, I'm male, female, whatever gender you might be. You know some Python. That's great. That's a good start. We're learning C# here because C# is so flexible and can be used so many ways. And Sugar, I would suggest, what type of program is going to bring you joy? Figure out what that type of program is, whether it's a website, it's a game, it's some machine learning algorithm, some artificial intelligence you may want to interact with, whatever it might be that's going to bring you joy, and learn a little bit of the programming frameworks around that type of program. C#, once you know the language, the world's your oyster. You can build games with the Unity framework. You can build web applications with ASP.NET. You can build desktop applications with Windows Forms, WPF, or UWP, the Universal Windows Platform. You can build for IoT devices using things like .NET Core. All kinds of options that are available to you when you learn C#, but go figure out what type of program you want to write and learn and focus your learning in that direction, and start figuring out what it is to bring joy for you. Is that Jans the Surlu asks, how do you find time to document your code when you have all the programming to do? So you can write some self-documenting code, right? Name your variables appropriately, where they kind of make sense what they do, right? First name, last name, it kind of makes sense what they do. And is enrolled, it kind of makes sense what that does, right? So you can kind of short circuit a little bit of that with this. Write some good comments. That, right? We haven't even gotten into there's special formatted comments that you can write inside your C# code when you declare a class that will make some documentation available to you in your Visual Studio Code, your Visual Studio Editor, your Project Writer Editor. You'll see some IntelliSense hints made available to you because you added some comments. So, but this is a very important thing to document. Really, having some good documentation about your application, about your algorithms and how you structure things is very important for other folks. The next programmer behind you that's going to have to maintain your code, it's very important for those folks so that your application, your game, whatever it might be, lives on. Lemons Galore says, yes, write simple code that is self-documenting. There's a school of thought that says you shouldn't have a method. We're not going to get in. Yeah, we're not going to get into methods today. You shouldn't have methods that are more than 7 lines of code. That way you aren't writing a lot of very complex code, and you actually are forced to make things a little bit simpler and group them together so you can have a little bit more self-documenting code. Caparino asks, can I explain the difference between equals and the fat arrow? My friend Scott Hanselman calls this the Anders operator, equals greater than, on properties with some examples. Let's talk about that briefly. So I'm going to add not just default values for properties here. Let's right? It's right. I forget exactly what it's called, but it's the fat arrow for properties. I'll put the appropriate name there. Details and sample to come, not to code to. Yeah. So I will add some more documentation there. The fat arrow notation that you see is a way, and you may see this as you get further into properties. It is a more recent feature of the language, but it's a way for you to force a property to be read-only, and it's calculated whenever it's referenced. That calculation is executed each time. So here I have age, right? Let me use this as an example. I'm going to comment out the age here for a second. If I create public int age, right, and I have get private set, and I say equals 20, right, and I run that, oh, I forgot a semicolon. There we go. It sets the value of age to 20 at the point that this class is created, okay? After that, you can't modify it because it's private set. It doesn't do anything. It's set the value and it's there. I can make that get set, and it sets that value, and you could change it later, but it sets a default value when you use equals. Now when you use the fat arrow notation, I see some more questions coming in, and I'm going to come to those in just a second after I finish this question about the fat arrow notation. I forget what it's called. I do. I can change this so that it's always evaluated. It's a derived value, and I can have it return this value right here. Right now, I held down Control and dragged that highlighted group so that it copied down. So what this is saying is, and right, this is why I wasn't too sure about getting into this in a beginner class, but this says the age is read-only such that the value is calculated using this formula, and there it is, calculated right there. So you see that it's going to be calculated each time. So if this changes, right, if it happens to be my birthday, today is August 17th, right? If it was August 17th here, right? Now it says age 20, but when it gets through to tomorrow, well, if it was, see, I'm doing that divide, and it's rounding here. Push that a little bit further out. Oh, come on. Heck, let's push it into September, right? 19. So if we're evaluating this and it gets to our birthday, right, that next time I reference age will be recalculated. It'll do this evaluation when I reference it, because it isn't the number 19 that is stored with age. It's this formula that is being evaluated every time I access it. Now, look at this. Happy birthday. No, John Calloway, is it your birthday? Well, happy birthday to you. It is a lambda expression. It is, right? This is, once again, Scott Hanselman refers to this as the Anders operator, named for Anders Hausberg. There is a technical name for it, but you'll hear C# folks read this operator as such that. So integer age such that, here's the value that we want it to calculate every time you reference that operator. So I will add a sample appropriate to describe and work with that, and I'll name it properly and add this section here for the fat arrow notation. The fat arrow is I think what they called it in JavaScript. So let me look down. There's a couple more questions that have come in from the chat room. I don't think we're going to get too much further on fields. There was a question on encapsulation, and we talked about default value for properties, and I've got a section that will add for that. Encapsulation is kind of what I'm doing here. Encapsulation, right? So let me make sure. Let's see. Add information about encapsulation. I'll make sure to add that. But encapsulation, let me go up here. Let's copy this, paste it. If we were encapsulating, encapsulation means something like where maybe we're receiving the name again, right? Instead of using get set here, we would create our own fields, right? And instead of doing this get and set here, right? A lot of C# developers got frustrated because this used to be the way that you interacted with properties is first name equals value. So you would define, here's my property, and I'll add another one here for last name. Boom, 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 and I'll add underscores. So you would define your properties, and you had to encapsulate. You had to specify the field behind the scenes that it would fetch from or write into. And for a lot of folks, this is like junior developer code. This is a waste of my time to write these, because for these two properties, first name and last name, you're not doing anything. But if you are in that scenario where you do want some other process to occur because you changed someone's name, we need to send a notification down to the teachers for this student that, hey, they changed their name, right? No longer is their name Joe Bag of Donuts. Now it's James Bag of Donuts, whatever it might be. I don't know. We need to send a notification to folks that occurred. Well, then you would add some extra code in here, right? Notify the teachers and about the name change, right? And I would have some code here that would notify teachers about this because you set that. Otherwise, yeah, this is kind of a waste to encapsulate and just write like this if you don't have some other code that you're going to add that does some other either notification, some other calculation. There's something else that happens because you changed this value. Maybe you're snooping around, and because somebody's reading that name value, I want to make a note that, hey, the name was just read into something, so I'm going to store that somewhere else, and you want to trigger something about that. Return is a keyword that we use to send a value back to whoever's interacting with this. That's how we do our read interactions, is we use the return keyword to send whatever the value of this field is back to whoever's reading from the first name. We use the value keyword in our property set accessor to refer to the value that has been passed in, that has been set for this property. So when I'm down here and I say s dot first name equals whatever, right? That set is interacted with. Display name change notification, right? And now when I run that, there's no argument given that corresponds to the required formal parameter of student. Yes, I didn't specify here. So maybe this is right. Jeff Stevens, and change this. Now, oh, I changed the first name. Last name. There we go. Now I've triggered, hey, we need to do a name change notification. And we should do something with this. Okay, so that's a little bit around encapsulation. All right, I see a few other comments and questions here. Are Visual Basic and Visual Basic for applications interchangeable? No. So if you just want to directly default values, if you just want to set default values on a property, use equals. If you want to derive, use the fat arrow. And you're right, you're deriving and you can't set the property, right? It's read-only when you set up a property like that. It's kind of like specifying a derived value, a calculated value, a lambda. It's not quite. Lambda is a name for the expression to the right of it. Let me take a look. Shogam, I see you repeating this question about Python over and over again. We got to it. We answered it. Thank you. Oh, that's a good point there. Where'd that go? I just saw it shift. Code with Sean makes a point here around this. Long ago, I would add proper case logic to properties names like these, so in case the name came in all uppercase or lowercase. Yeah, that's pretty good. Makes sense. Right, so that you always get, right, instead of Jeff Stevens specified this way, right, you would get it in the appropriate casing there. Makes perfect sense. Yeah. Yep. Yes, GK Smith, that operator is supported in several different forms, but I'm only showing it with the property here. We're not showing it in the method use later. That'll be later when we get to generics and lambdas. There's a whole world of learning there that we will hit in the future. All right, so I have a bit of information here that I'm going to add and trim out a little bit of this this notebook. We talked about encapsulation. I didn't talk about constants. So while we have fields that you can interact with and you can set values on, sure, let's add an entry here for constants. So I'll no, let's turn this into Markdown. So constants, right? Some docs, and write a constant. No, delete that. Let's copy down. Yeah, let's copy this one down. So we have the same. Right, I mentioned we might have something like a public. You define a constant with the const keyword, and sure, we'll make it an integer, and we'll call this maximum years enrolled, and maybe it's 5. That is a compiler time known value. It's known at the time that this is executed. You can't make it a value that's evaluated. You can't derive and calculate the value of a constant. So it's 5. And consequently then, down here, while I may create a new student, I can specify s dot maximum years enrolled. Let me copy that. Right? And it's, well, thanks. You can't actually reference it as a property on the student instance. It's a property on the student because it's a constant belonging to the student. Okay, I can interact with that constant inside of the instance, right? So I can do here, I can say something like maximum years enrolled during the constructor, right? And I can add that value here. So addition with strings does string concatenation. I'll run that and it outputs it there. So a constant is a way for us to stash values that are never changing and always going to be used with our class, right? Just like fields and our properties, these can have different scope access modifiers. I don't have to make it public. I can make it internal. I don't want programs outside of my program to be able to interact with it. I can make it private. It's only accessible to this class. Okay? I can make it protected and protected internal, and those are things that have to deal with inheritance. And when we talk about inheritance, we'll get to that later. So, definitely things that you can do with constants. I will add some documentation to that. I can remove, right, I can make these simpler again inside of our notebook so that it's a little bit shorter and easier to read through this bit of that. Let me just turn this into a get set again so it's not calculating. There we go. And I've got an extra curly brace there. Get rid of that. There we go. All right. So I think that's all we're going to talk about today. I briefly got into constants, default value properties, encapsulation. Need the fat arrow docs. I'll make sure I add that. I didn't get into partial class keyword. I think I'm going to move that down and talk about that with abstract classes and interfaces. So let me add that to that request. And I see my friend Cecil here wants me to talk about classes versus structs. Yeah, we'll talk about that. Partial class definition and usage, because there's definitely something to talk about around partial classes. Let me answer a couple more questions here in the chat room, and we will wrap it up for today, because I gotta go. I got meetings to get to. Let's see, what do we got? Thank you, Code with Sean, for sharing the link to the GitHub repository. Shugam, you can rewind and see the answer to your question. There's a question here from Mosa. Why don't we have an editor like Visual Studio Code in Visual Studio? You find the Visual Studio editor and IntelliSense kind of inadequate. That's interesting because the Visual Studio editor and IntelliSense was written first and has more features than the Visual Studio Code editor. So a little bit more information about what you're looking for there, but it's the same team that writes both. So let me know. We can talk about that later. All right, friends, I think that's all the time that we have together today. I am going to take our notebook that we updated, we put some information into. I am going to commit it here in my local repository. I will update it and we'll get it published out for you on the GitHub repository. If you're watching the recording, this has already been updated. This is already available for you with all the latest features, and you can find it out there on the Jupyter Notebook binder. Updated with notes, demos, and feedback from, let's call it live stream number 2. There we go. And of course, my Yuba key needs to be reset. This is kind of an ongoing thing with my machine. There we go. I'm not going to push it out. I'm going to be able to work on it locally, but I've saved those changes, and we will talk more about, we will get into more around classes. We'll talk about methods. We'll talk about abstract classes, interfaces, and we're going to get into the partial class keyword. I think we may do that next time as we go through and we work on more learning about C# together here, live on the Visual Studio channel. If you're watching the recording, that's great. I'm glad you tuned in and watched. All the fun happens right here, twitch.tv/Visual Studio, and you can find out, ask your questions. We're happy to answer, we're happy to tinker and interact with our notebook, but I encourage you to tinker on your own. Make some changes, break things. You saw I created some errors and it doesn't damage anything. Try it out. And you might learn something, alright? But check us out right back here, twitch.tv/Visual Studio, Monday mornings, 9 a.m. Eastern, 6 a.m. Pacific, 1300 UTC, and it's something like 11 p.m. in Sydney. So if you like staying up late and late night coding there, and you're in the APAC, the Asia Pacific region, welcome in.